The air inside the Oakbridge Community Center was thick with the smell of floor wax, old paper programs, and the sharp metallic tang of anxiety. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October, the kind of day where the gray sky outside made the indoor fluorescent lights feel even harsher. The annual Regional Talent Showcase was a serious business for the people in this town. For the parents lining the back walls of the auditorium, it wasn't just a show. It was a scoreboard. They held coffees in one hand and phones in the other, checking emails or texting sitters, but their eyes were darting around the room. Sizing up the competition in the middle of this buzzing tension sat a girl who seemed entirely out of place. Her name was Emily. She was 22 years old, with a round, open face and eyes that seemed to take in everything but judge nothing. She had Down syndrome. While the other contestants, teenagers in crisp dresses or suits with slicked-back hair, were frantically whispering last-minute advice to each other or nervously shaking their legs, Emily was sitting still. She was on a folding chair backstage. Just behind the heavy velvet curtain that separated the hopefuls from the judges, Emily's mother, Diane, sat beside her. Rubbing her daughter's back in slow, rhythmic circles, Diane looked tired. It was a specific kind of tired that came from years of advocating, of explaining, of holding her breath in waiting rooms and classrooms. Today, that breath was being held tighter than ever. She watched the other competitors. A tall boy with a violin was pacing back and forth, playing silent scales on his neck. A girl with a powerful voice was humming high notes, her eyes closed in dramatic preparation. They looked sharp, polished, dangerous. Then Diane looked at Emily. Emily was wearing a bright blue dress that she had picked out herself. It wasn't the fashion choice of a serious classical musician. It was the choice of someone who liked the color blue. She wasn't reviewing sheet music in her head, because Emily didn't read sheet music the way the others did. She was just swinging her legs slightly, humming a tune that didn't match the nervous atmosphere. "Do you want some water, Em?" Diane asked softly. Emily looked up, her smile wide and immediate. "Water for the fingers," she said. Using the phrase she always used, Diane handed her a bottle, and Emily took a small sip, mimicking the sips she had seen the violinist take earlier, but with much more joy behind them. Leaning against a stack of amplifiers was Emily's father. Mark, he had his arms crossed over his chest, a protective stance he had perfected over 2 decades. He watched the crowd through a slit in the curtain. He could see the rows of people filling up. It was a full house. That was good for the event, but it made his stomach churn. He listened to the murmur of the audience. It wasn't a hostile noise, but it was a noise that didn't have much patience. People were shuffling programs, unwrapping candies, and talking about their weekends. They were waiting to be entertained. They were waiting to be impressed. They wanted to see prodigies. They wanted to see kids who were destined for Juilliard. Mark looked at a group of 3 men sitting near the front. They were holding clipboards at judges. One of them was checking his watch. Another was tapping his pen against his chin, looking bored already. Mark knew what they were thinking. He knew because he had seen it 1,000 times. When they looked at the program and saw Emily piano performance, they probably expected something simple. They expected chopsticks, expected a cute, clunky performance that would get a polite, pitying applause. "Did you see that violin kid?" A voice whispered from the other side of the curtain. It was one of the other performers, a teenage girl with perfect hair. "He's been playing since he was 3. He's amazing." "Yeah," another voice replied. "It's going to be tough to beat. I heard the girl after him is good too. But then there's, you know," the voice dropped to a harsh whisper, but in the quiet of the backstage area, it carried. "The girl with the special needs act? I mean, it's nice they let everyone play, but is it really a competition?" Diane's hand froze on Emily's back. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the familiar sting of tears that she refused to let fall. She squeezed Emily's shoulder. Emily didn't seem to hear the whisper, or if she did, she didn't understand the cruelty in it. She just kept looking at her hands, opening and closing her fingers, feeling the muscles. "She's not an act," Mark said, his voice low but carrying a sudden sharpness. The 2 teenagers froze, looking guilty. "She's a musician," Mark finished, staring at them until they turned away. Blushing and embarrassed, Diane looked up at her husband and offered a weak smile. He was fierce for her, always had been. But the doubt was everywhere. It hung in the air like smoke. Emily was different. In a world that valued speed, complexity, and cool detachment, Emily was slow, simple, and overflowing with emotion. The world of competitive music was not built for someone like her. It was built for the violinist pacing back and forth, counting the beats. Emily, oblivious to the tension, tapped her mother on the arm. "The keys are shiny today," she whispered conspiratorially. "Yes, sweetie." "They shined them for the show," Diane said. "I like the shiny." "It makes the notes happy," Emily said. Diane nodded, smoothing a stray hair behind Emily's ear. That was how Emily saw the world. The piano wasn't a machine to be conquered. It was a friend. The notes weren't data points. They were living things with feelings. But would the judges see that? Or would they just see a girl struggling to find the right keys, feeling awkwardness instead of art? Out in the auditorium, the master of ceremonies walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit him and he tapped the microphone, causing a squeal of feedback that made everyone flinch. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 50th Annual Regional Showcase," he announced, his voice booming. The polite clapping grew louder. "We have an incredible lineup for you today. The talent this year is truly breathtaking." Backstage, the energy shifted. The pacing got faster. The panic set in. The violinist stopped pacing and closed his eyes, taking deep breaths. The singer stopped humming and started shaking out her hands. Emily just sat there, calm as a lake at dawn. She looked at her father. "Is it time soon, Daddy?" "Soon, Em. Not yet," Mark said, kneeling down so he was face to face with her. "You remember what we talked about? You just play. You don't worry about them. You just listen to the music." Emily nodded solemnly. "Just the music," she repeated. But the problem wasn't that Emily would forget to listen to the music. The problem was that the audience wouldn't listen to her. The announcer introduced the first act. The applause was loud. The music began. Emily sat with her hands in her lap, waiting her turn. She was fifth in the lineup. It felt like a lifetime. The first 3 acts were technically flawless, but they lacked something. They were perfect, but they were sterile. The audience clapped politely, checking their watches. Then came the 4th act. A young man playing a fast, complicated jazz piece on a saxophone. The crowd loved it. They clapped along. They whistled. The energy in the room went up. It was the kind of performance that demanded attention. It was loud, brash, and confident. When he finished, the room was buzzing. People were whispering excitedly. "That's the one to beat," someone said loudly. The announcer walked back out. "And now for our next performer," he said. "Please welcome Emily." There was a pause. A polite scattered applause. It wasn't the roar the saxophone player got. It was the clatter of people being nice. A few people shifted in their seats. A man in the 3rd row leaned over to his wife and whispered, "This is the break time, right? Let's go get a drink." The assumption was clear. This wasn't going to be good. This was going to be the moment where the tension dropped. This was the cute part of the show. Mark watched his daughter stand up. She smoothed down her blue dress. She didn't look nervous. She looked happy. She didn't walk with the confident swagger of the jazz musician or the rigid posture of the classical players. She walked with a heavy, steady step. Her eyes fixed on the big black grand piano sitting in the center of the spotlight. Diane watched her go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to run out there and grab her hand, take her back to the car, drive her somewhere where people understood her shine without having to grade it. But she stayed put. She held onto the curtain. She watched the room as Emily walked across the stage. The rustling of papers and candy wrappers continued. The judges looked down at their papers, ready to write a score that wouldn't hurt anyone's feelings, but wouldn't threaten the winners. The man in the 3rd row stood up, thinking he could slip out during the intro. Emily reached the piano. It was huge. It looked like it could swallow her whole. She adjusted the bench. The screech of the bench legs against the floor echoed through the auditorium. A few people giggled nervously. She sat down. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling. She placed her hands on the keys. They were small hands, slightly thick at the fingers. They didn't look like the hands of a virtuoso. The room grew quiet, but it was an impatient quiet. It was the silence of people waiting for a traffic light to change. Then, Emily played the first note. It wasn't a cute note. It wasn't a simple note. It was a sound that seemed to come from the floorboards, deep and resonant. The man who was standing up to leave froze. He sat back down. The judge with the wandering pen stopped tapping. The mother in the back row stopped looking at her phone. The girl who everyone had underestimated took a breath, and the world around her leaned in. Asterisk, as the vibration of that first deep note still hung in the air. Touching the walls of the auditorium, the minds of the people in the room began to drift. They were pulled away from the present moment on the stage and thrown into the invisible. Backstory of the young woman sitting at the piano. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand that the music didn't just happen by magic. It wasn't a gift from a fairy godmother. It was built, brick by brick, in a small living room that smelled always of lavender polish and determination. The story of this music really started 12 years ago, when the girl was just 10 years old. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining the kind of gray rain that makes you want to sleep. Her mother, Diane, was cleaning the kitchen, trying to ignore the sound of the phone ringing. She knew who it was. It was the school again. It seemed like the school called every week with a new problem. They wanted to talk about reading levels. They wanted to talk about social integration. They wanted to talk about why the girl wouldn't stop humming during math class. Diane answered the phone, her shoulders already up near her ears. But the voice on the other end wasn't the principal. It was the music teacher, Mr. Henderson. He was an older man, with hair like white cotton candy and fingers that were stained yellow from cigarettes. "She has an ear," Mr. Henderson said. "I don't know how to explain it. The other kids were banging on the drums today, and she walked over to the old upright piano in the corner. She just hit 3 notes. But they were the right notes. They were in harmony. It was intentional." Diane had paused, the sponge in her hand dripping soapy water onto the floor. "Intentional? But she can't even read her alphabet yet, Mr. Henderson." "Music isn't always about letters," he said. "It's about listening. And she listens to everything." That weekend, Diane and her husband, Mark, made a decision. It wasn't an easy one. Money was tight. Raising a child with special needs came with a mountain of doctor bills and therapy costs that never seemed to end. A piano seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford, but they found an old second-hand spinet piano. It was scratched on the side, and one of the pedals stuck when you pushed it too hard. When they delivered it, the girl stood in the doorway of the living room, her eyes wide. She walked up to it slowly, like it was a sleeping animal, and touched the keys. She smiled, and Diane knew that every penny would be worth it. But the journey wasn't a straight line. It was a jagged, rocky path full of frustration. When other children were learning to play hot cross buns in a single afternoon, the girl was still trying to make her left hand do something different than her right hand. The concept of coordination was a huge wall for her. Her brain worked differently. It saw the world in beautiful, broad pictures. But sometimes the small details, like pressing a key firmly but gently, or counting a beat of 4, got lost in the shuffle. There were days, many days, when the living room was not filled with music, but with tears. The girl would sit on the bench, her fists clenched in her lap, shouting, "I can't. My hands are broken." She didn't understand that it took time. She wanted to be perfect right now. She saw how her older cousins could pick up a guitar and strum a song, and she felt the heavy, unfair weight of her own limitations. Diane would sit beside her on the bench, wiping her daughter's tears. "Your hands aren't broken," she would say softly. "They are just waking up. We have to wake them up slowly." So, they turned the learning process into a game. They didn't use standard music books at first. Those lines and dots on the page looked like confusing black ants to her. Instead, they used colors. Mr. Henderson came up with a system. The C keys were blue. The F keys were red. The G keys were yellow. He drew little pictures of happy faces for the notes that held on longer, and short dashes for the quick notes. It was a language she could understand. She practiced every single day. While the neighborhood kids were out riding bikes in the street, shouting and playing tag, she was inside, working on the same measure of music for a week, 2 weeks, sometimes a whole month. Mark would sit in his armchair, reading the newspaper, listening to the same 4 notes played over and over again. Clunk, miss clunk, clunk. He never complained. He never told her to stop. He just turned the page of his paper and listened. He knew that she was fighting a battle that nobody else could see. She was fighting to make her body obey her heart. And every time she finally got it right, the look on her face, pure. Radiant triumph was better than any symphony he could have heard in a concert hall. As she got older, the challenge changed. It wasn't just about hitting the right keys anymore. It was about expression. Music is emotional. It breathes. You have to play loud in some parts and soft in others. You have to speed up and slow down. For a girl who lived her life with such intense, straightforward emotion, this was hard. She didn't understand a little bit sad. To her, you were either happy or you were crying. There was a famous piece of music she fell in love with a few years ago. A complex piece by a composer named Chopin. It was the kind of song that real pianists played. It had big jumps and fast runs and moments of intense power. When she first heard it on a record, she started crying. "This is the song, Mommy," she said. "This is the song inside me." Mr. Henderson had shook his head. "It's too hard," he told her gently. "Your hands are strong, but that song is very fast. Maybe we try something easier? Something pretty?" But the girl was stubborn. She had a quiet kind of steel in her spine. She didn't want to play pretty. She wanted to play this song. She wanted to show the world the storm and the calm that she felt inside, so they broke it down. They took the song apart like a car engine, laying all the pieces on the floor. She learned the right hand first. Just the melody. It took her 6 months to get it smooth. It was agonizing. There were nights when Diane wanted to call the teacher and say, "Let's quit. Let's just let her play for fun." But she saw how hard her daughter tried. She saw the calluses forming on her fingertips. And she knew that quitting wasn't an option if you wanted to teach your child that they could conquer mountains. The left hand was the bass, the heartbeat. It was even harder. She had to learn to jump her thumb under her fingers to reach the next note. Her brain would get mixed up. Her fingers would tangle up. She would get so frustrated that she would bang the keys, making a terrible noise, and then run to her room and hide under the covers. But the next morning, she would always come back. She would sit down, crack her knuckles, a habit she thought made her look like a pro, and try again. The breakthrough didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, like the sun coming up in the morning. One day, the mess of notes started to sound like a melody. Then the melody started to have a rhythm. Then the rhythm started to have feelings. She stopped looking at the colored stickers on the keys. She started to feel where the notes were. Her hands developed a memory of their own. Mark noticed it first. He was in the kitchen making coffee, and he heard her playing. He stopped pouring the water. He listened. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the technical perfection of a robot. It was better. It had a swing to it. It had a soul. She was speeding up in the exciting parts, not because the sheet music told her to, but because she felt excited. She was slowing down at the end because she felt peaceful. "She's got it," Mark whispered to Diane, standing in the hallway. "She's actually doing it." When she finally played the whole piece from start to finish without a single stop, Mr. Henderson sat in silence for a long time. He looked at the girl, who was sitting with her hands in her lap, grinning. "You didn't play the notes exactly as they are written," he said. The girl's smile faltered a little bit. "I played them wrong." "No," the teacher said, his voice cracking slightly. "You played them. True. You played them like they feel. That is much harder." So by the time she walked onto that stage today, she wasn't the same person who had banged on the piano keys 10 years ago. She was a warrior who had fought a 10-year war to express herself. Every note she knew to play was a victory. Every pause was a moment of peace she had earned. She wasn't there to show off her disability. She wasn't there to be a token. She was there because she had earned the right to be there, through sweat and tears and stubborn love. The audience didn't know this history. They didn't know about the sticky-colored stickers, or the calluses, or the days spent hiding under the covers. They just saw a girl in a blue dress. But the music she was about to play carried the weight of every single practice session. It was the sound of a girl who refused to be underestimated, even by her own hands. And as she took a deep breath on that stage, she wasn't thinking about the judges or the crowd. She was thinking about the journey. She was thinking about the music. And she was ready to set it free. The sound of the first note seemed to hang in the air like a heavy cloud. But then it faded, and the silence of the room rushed back in. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realize they have to be polite, even if they are confused. A few people in the back row stopped talking to their neighbors. The man in the third row, who had stood up to leave, slowly sat back down, but he kept his coat on, ready to bolt the moment the performance was over. On stage, the girl in the blue dress sat completely still. She wasn't looking at the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on the black and white keys in front of her. She moved the bench forward an inch. The legs of the bench scraped against the floor with a high-pitched squeak that made several people in the audience flinch. A nervous giggle came from somewhere near the front, followed quickly by a loud "she." In the wings, just off to the side of the heavy curtain, her parents stood frozen. Her father, Mark, had his hands gripping the metal frame of the stage equipment so hard his knuckles were turning white. He knew what the audience was thinking. He could feel the waves of skepticism rolling off the crowd, like heat from a sidewalk. They were waiting for the special moment. They were expecting a halting, maybe off-key version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. They expected to be able to pat themselves on the back for being kind enough to listen. He looked at the judges. The man in the middle, the one with the expensive watch, had his pen hovering just above the paper. He hadn't written anything yet. He was looking at his watch, then at the stage, then at his watch again. He was calculating how long this would take. The judges on either side were shifting in their seats, their faces masks of professional patience, the kind you wear when you are waiting for a dentist appointment to be over. The girl took a deep breath. It was a visible breath. Her shoulders rose up high, touching her ears, and then fell down slowly. She was running the song in her head one last time. She wasn't thinking about the people. She was thinking about the story the music told. She was thinking about the storm and the quiet after the storm. Then she lifted her hands. For a moment, they hovered over the keys. Her hands looked small and soft against the sharp edges of the piano. Her fingers were slightly curled, just the way her teacher had taught her. "Hold an orange in your hand," he used to say. She didn't have an orange, but she had the memory of the shape. She struck the first chord. It wasn't a simple single note. It was a major chord, struck firmly. It rang out with a rich, full sound that filled the front of the auditorium instantly. The man in the third row, who had his hand on his knee ready to push himself up, stopped moving. The sound was stronger than he expected. It wasn't a tentative plink. It was a statement. The girl didn't stop. She moved her right hand immediately, playing a melody that cascaded down the keys like water running over rocks. It was fast. It was complicated. The change in the room was physical. You could almost see the heads of the audience members snap forward. The man with the expensive watch looked up from his paper. The pen in his hand didn't move. The judge on the left stopped looking at her fingernails and stared at the girl's hands. For the first 10 seconds, there was a feeling of disbelief. The audience didn't know what to do. The music they were hearing didn't match the image they were seeing. They heard a professional, complex melody, but they saw a girl they had labeled as slow. It confused their brains. The whispers that had been floating through the air just moments before vanished completely. On stage, the girl was in another world. Her face, usually so open and smiling, was serious now. She was concentrating deeply. Her tongue poked out slightly from the corner of her mouth, a sign of the intense focus she was using to make her hands obey her. Her body swayed back and forth, not in a rhythmic, practiced way, but in a natural movement, like a tree in the wind. She was feeling the music. The song she was playing had a lot of jumps in the left hand. Her left hand had to jump from the low bass notes all the way up to the middle, while her right hand played fast, intricate patterns in the high notes. This was the part she had struggled with for months in the living room. This was the part where her hands usually got tangled. The audience held its collective breath. It was as if everyone in the room suddenly became an expert on piano playing. They sensed the difficulty. They watched as her left hand darted across the keys. She didn't miss. Not one note. The transition was smooth. The bass note landed with a deep thump, grounding the melody, and her right hand took off again. Playing a run of notes that was so fast it almost blurred, the silence deepened. But now it wasn't a silence of boredom or awkwardness. It was a silence of awe. The room had been noisy with the sound of people's own lives, their rustling, their coughing, their internal judgments. Now, all of that noise was gone. The only thing that existed in the world was the sound coming from the grand piano. The girl moved into the bridge of the song, the part where the music gets soft and gentle. The heavy banging of the bass stopped, and the melody became light, like a whisper. She touched the keys delicately. The contrast was shocking. One moment she was playing with the force of a thunderstorm, and the next, she was barely touching the keys, playing sounds that were as fragile as glass. The man in the third row finally took his hand off his knee. He wasn't going anywhere. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the stage. He had stopped seeing a girl with Down syndrome. He was just seeing a musician. He was just hearing the music in the back. The girl's mother, Diane, let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She grabbed Mark's arm and squeezed. Mark didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on his daughter, but he squeezed her hand back. He saw the tiny flicker of sweat on her forehead. He saw the tension in her jaw. He knew how hard she was working to maintain the rhythm. He knew that inside her head, she was counting, she was feeling, she was fighting to keep the flow going. The judges were gone. The judges who had been ready to give her a participation trophy score were now leaning forward in their seats. The man with the pen had completely forgotten about his watch. He was looking at the girl's hands with a professional curiosity. He was analyzing the technique, trying to figure out how she was doing it. He had judged her before she played, based on a stereotype. Now, the music was forcing him to admit that he was wrong. He wasn't just hearing a nice tune. He was hearing control. He was hearing dynamics. He was hearing a mastery that took most people years of conservatory training to achieve. The girl reached the climax of the piece. The music began to build again, layer by layer. It started low, grew higher, and then exploded into a flurry of sound. Both hands were moving rapidly now, covering the entire keyboard. Her body was moving with the music, her dress swaying. Her eyes were closed tight, shutting out the lights, the judges, the expectations. She was just a vessel for the music. The sound was huge. It filled every corner of the auditorium. It vibrated in the chests of the people sitting in the cheap seats at the very back. It was a sound that demanded respect. The teenager who had made the rude comment backstage earlier was standing in the wings. He had his violin under his arm. He had been smirking when he heard her name called. Now, his mouth was slightly open. He was watching her fingers. He knew enough about music to know that what she was doing was incredibly difficult. He felt a sudden knot of nervousness in his own stomach. How is he going to follow this? The music began to slow down. The rapid notes slowed into a rhythm. The loudness began to soften, fading away like a light being dimmed. The girl's hands slowed down. She played the final chord, a gentle, resolving harmony that told the story was over. She held the chord. Her fingers pressed down into the keys, letting the sound vibrate and ring out. She didn't lift her hands immediately. She kept her head bowed, listening to the sound as it faded away into nothingness. And then there was silence. But it wasn't the silence from before. The room was still. The air was still. 300 people were holding their breath. No one moved. No one checked their phone. No one whispered. The silence was heavy, not with judgment, but with the weight of what they had just experienced. They'd been hit by something they didn't expect. They were stunned. They were processing the fact that they had just been taught a lesson by a girl they had underestimated. The silence was the loudest thing that had happened in that room all day. Asterisk. The girl sat with her fingers still resting on the keys, listening to the final vibrations of the sound fade into the air. The chord hung there for what felt like a long time, drifting up into the high ceiling of the hall, disappearing into the dark rafters. On stage, she was perfectly still, her eyes closed, her head bowed. She wasn't posing. She was just saying goodbye to the song in her mind. In the audience, the silence stretched on. It was a heavy, thick silence. For 5 seconds, no one moved. The man in the third row sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his coat forgotten on his lap. The judges sat motionless, their pens hovering over the paper, unmoving. The teenager in the wings with the violin stopped, shaking his hands, and just stared, his eyes wide. For that brief moment, the world stopped being a place of categories and labels. There was no special needs and no typical. There was just the echo of something beautiful that had happened. The skepticism, the pity, the low expectations, all of it, had been blown away by the sound that came from the piano. The audience was silent not because they were bored, but because they were shocked. They had to take a moment to reset their brains. They had to reconcile what they had just heard with what they had believed when they first saw the girl walk on stage. Then, sound broke the quiet. It wasn't a clap. It was the sound of someone taking a deep, shaky breath. It came from the front row. Then a man stood up. He was an older gentleman, sitting near the aisle. He didn't stand up to leave. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking a little in the quiet room. He looked at the stage, and then he put his hands together. He started to clap. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a slow, rhythmic clap of genuine respect. At first, it sounded lonely in the big hall. But then, a woman 2 rows behind him stood up and joined in. Then another. Within seconds, like a wave rising from the ocean, the entire center section of the audience stood up. The sound grew from a few claps to a roar. It wasn't the standard applause for a contestant in a small-town show. It was a thunder. It was a wall of sound that hit the stage. The girl opened her eyes. She pulled her hands back from the keys and placed them in her lap. She looked up, blinking against the bright spotlight. For a second, she looked confused. She couldn't see the audience clearly because of the lights. She just saw a dark void where the noise was coming from. Her father, Mark, watched from the side. He saw the look on her face, a mix of, "Did I do it right? And is it over?" He felt a lump in his throat the size of a grapefruit. He saw the man who had tried to leave earlier standing now, clapping so hard his hands were red. He saw the judges smiling, really smiling for the first time all day. The judge with the pen had tossed his pen onto the table. He wasn't taking notes anymore. He was just watching. The noise got louder. It wasn't just clapping anymore. People were shouting, "Bravo." A voice screamed from the back. "Yes," someone else yelled. A little girl in the front row started jumping up and down. The girl on the bench seemed to realize that the noise was for her. A slow smile spread across her face. It wasn't the polite, rehearsed smile of a pageant contestant. It was a radiant, beaming smile that showed all her teeth. Her eyes crinkled up in delight. She looked over to the side of the stage where her parents were. Diane was crying, but she was laughing too. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and gave her daughter a thumbs up. Mark nodded, his face serious but full of pride. The girl stood up. She smoothed down the front of her blue dress, a habit she had whenever she felt happy. She turned to face the darkness where the audience was sitting. She didn't bow like a performer might bow with a flourish. She just gave a small, shy curtsy. Then she remembered what she was supposed to do. She gave a little wave. It was a wave that said, "Hi, I see you. I'm happy to." The audience went wild. They loved the wave. It was unpolished. It was real. It was a strange and powerful moment for everyone in the room. The people who had come to judge a talent show realized they had just been judged themselves. They had looked at a cover of a book and decided they knew the story inside. They had been arrogant. They had been wrong. And now, looking at this young woman beaming in the spotlight, They felt a collective sense of humility. The music had done it. The music had spoken a language that didn't need words. It didn't matter that the girl had different chromosomes. It didn't matter that she learned slowly. It didn't matter that she couldn't read a standard sentence as fast as the others. When her fingers hit those keys, none of that existed. There was only the melody. There was only the passion. There was only the talent. And it was raw talent. It wasn't the dry, technical perfection of a robot. It was messy and emotional and alive. Every person in that hall felt it. They felt the storm she had played, and they felt the calm. They felt her struggle in the difficult parts, and they felt her joy in the easy parts. It was the most human thing they had heard all day. The announcer walked back onto the stage, clapping. He looked a little dazed himself. He walked over to the girl and gently guided her to the center of the stage. He raised his hands to try and quiet the crowd, but they didn't want to stop. They kept clapping. It went on for nearly a minute. In the world of competitive piano, a minute of applause is an eternity. Finally, the noise died down enough for the announcer to speak. He leaned into the microphone, looked at the girl, and then looked at the crowd. "I think that says it all," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He had said this line 100 times, but this time he meant it. The girl looked up at him, then back at the piano. She walked over and patted the top of the piano like it was a pony that had carried her on a good ride. The audience laughed in awe at the same time. In that moment, the underestimation evaporated. No one looked at her as the girl with Down syndrome anymore. They just looked at her as the pianist, looked at her as an artist. She had dragged them out of their comfort zones and forced them to see the world through her eyes for 5 minutes. She had shown them that beauty doesn't always come in the package we expect. She stood there, bathed in the yellow light, not worried about what came next. Not worried about the scorecards, just happy that she had shared her song. The room was buzzing with an energy that hadn't been there before. The people in the audience looked at each other, nodding, strangers sharing a moment of connection. They all knew they had witnessed something rare. They had just been silenced by a girl who was supposed to be quiet. Asterisk, the applause continued to echo in her ears even after she walked off the stage and back into the dim, cramped space behind the curtain. It was a heavy, loud sound that seemed to vibrate right through her chest, making her heart beat faster than normal. As soon as she was out of the spotlight, the brightness faded, and the cool air of the backstage area wrapped around her. Her parents were there instantly. Before she could even say anything, she was wrapped in a hug that smelled like her mother's perfume and her father's jacket. It was the kind of hug that squeezed all the air out of her, but she didn't mind. She buried her face in her father's shoulder. She wasn't crying, but she was shaking a little bit. It was the adrenaline leaving her body, making her legs feel wobbly. "You did it," her father whispered, his voice sounding thick and rough. "You really did it." "I played the storm," she whispered back, her voice muffled by his coat. "And then the sun came out," as her mother said, pulling back to wipe a smudge of mascara from under her own eye. The sun came out for everyone. The mood backstage had changed completely. Just 10 minutes ago, the hallway had been filled with nervous energy and polite whispers. Now, it was buzzing with a different kind of electricity. The other contestants, the ones who had been checking their phones and sizing up the competition, were standing against the walls, looking at her with wide eyes. The teenager with the violin was staring at his own instrument, almost as if he was seeing it for the first time. When the girl walked by him, holding her father's hand, he stepped out of her way. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked humbled. "That was incredible," he stammered, looking at the floor. "I didn't know you could play like that." The girl smiled at him. It was her regular, friendly smile, not a performance smile. "I like the keys," she said simply. "They are my friends." The violinist nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "Yeah, I could hear that." Parents guided her over to a chair so she could rest. The crowd outside was still settling down. The announcer was on stage again, his voice booming as he introduced the next act, but it felt like an anticlimax. How could anyone follow what had just happened? The audience had been taken on a journey. They were still trying to find their way back to their seats, asterisk. While the girl sat drinking a juice box that a stagehand had handed her. The judges were huddled together at their long table. They were whispering intensely. Usually scoring was a quick mechanical process. You checked the box for technique, you checked the box for tone, and you wrote a number. But this was different. The judge with the expensive watch was shaking his head. He was looking down at his scorecard, where he had already written a number, then scratched it out, then written another. He looked at the other two judges. "We can't give her a pity score," he said firmly. "That would be an insult. If she played like that at a conservatory, she would get a standing ovation there, too." "I agree," one of the other judges replied. "It wasn't technically perfect in the textbook sense. But the emotion? The control. I've been teaching for 30 years, and I can't get my students to play with that kind of soul." They nodded in agreement. They weren't judging a disability category. They weren't judging special needs. They were judging music. And they knew deep down that they had just heard something that many musicians play for a lifetime and never find. They picked up their pens and marked the highest scores of the day. The rest of the show went on. There were dancers and singers and more instrumentalists. They were all talented. They were all practiced. But the energy in the room had shifted. The girls' performance had raised the bar. It had reminded everyone that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about telling the truth. The audience clapped politely for the others. But the memory of the piano performance lingered like a ghost in the room. When the show finally ended, the organizers called everyone back onto the stage for the awards ceremony. The girl stood in the back row, holding her mother's hand. She was tired now. The excitement was wearing off, and she just wanted to go home and maybe have some ice cream. She watched the other contestants receive their certificates. They were nice, shiny pieces of paper. Then the announcer stepped up to the microphone one last time. And now for the grand prize. The award for the most outstanding performance of the day. The room went quiet. The teenager with the violin tightened his grip on his instrument case. The singer who had hummed high notes held her breath. Da 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 da. The winner is... The announcer paused for dramatic effect, opening the envelope. He looked out at the crowd, and a small smile played on his lips. He knew this was a moment that would be talked about in this town for a long time. The winner is... our pianist. For a second, there was absolute silence. Then the noise erupted. It wasn't just clapping this time. People were stomping their feet. It was a roar of approval. The girl didn't move at first. She looked up at her mother, confused. "They're calling your name, sweetie," Diane said, her voice trembling. "Me?" The girl asked. "Yes, you. Go." Her father gave her a gentle nudge. She let go of her mother's hand and walked forward through the line of other contestants. As she passed them, something amazing happened. They didn't look jealous. They didn't look angry. They smiled at her. Some of them patted her on the back. The violinist high-fived her as she walked by. It was a silent acknowledgement among musicians. They knew she had earned it. She walked to the center of the stage. The announcer handed her a large trophy. It was made of gold-colored plastic, and it sparkled under the lights. To her, it looked like a giant sun. She took it with both hands. It was heavy. She looked out at the crowd. The lights were in her eyes, so she couldn't see individual faces, but she could feel them. She could feel the love and the respect coming at her in waves. It wasn't the pity she had felt before. This was real. She didn't make a speech. She didn't know how to say thank you for this honor in a fancy way. So, she just held the trophy up high like a prize she had caught in a game. She flashed her huge, radiant smile. "Thank you," she shouted into the microphone, her voice booming and clear. "I love the piano." The crowd laughed and cheered even louder as she walked off the stage for the last time. Trophy in hand, her parents met her. They didn't say anything. They just walked her out of the community center and into the cool night air. It was dark outside. The streetlights were on, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The noise of the event faded behind them. The world was quiet again. "You hungry?" her father asked. "Fries," the girl said immediately. "Big fries. We can do big fries," her mother laughed. They walked to the car slowly. The girl held her trophy in one hand and her father's hand in the other. She looked up at the sky. The stars were popping out, one by one. The day had started with whispers. It had started with people looking at her and seeing only what she couldn't do. They saw a label. They saw a limitation. They saw a girl who didn't fit into their boxes. But she had changed all that. She didn't change it by arguing. She didn't change it by fighting. She changed it by being herself. She sat down at a piano and she poured her heart out onto the keys. She let her talent do the talking. She got into the back seat of the car and buckled her seatbelt. She placed the trophy on her lap, stroking the gold plastic gently. She knew that the trophy was nice. It was shiny and heavy. But as she looked out the window at the passing streetlights, she knew that the best part of the day wasn't the prize. The best part was the silence. That magical silence after the last note, where hundreds of people finally understood. They had underestimated her. They had looked at the cover and judged the book. But for 5 minutes, she made them listen. She made them see her. She made them feel, and as the car pulled away, heading toward the promise of hot fries and a warm bed, the girl hummed a quiet melody. It was a new song she was making up in her head. It was a happy song, because she knew without a doubt that she could do anything she wanted to do. She just had to play her own music.